Before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. And as you listen, rate this story from 1 to 10 at the end because your feedback really keeps us going. Now, imagine this. A man who had everything, wealth, respect, cars, houses, power, decides to gamble with the one thing no one should ever play with, another human being's dignity. This is the story of a millionaire who married a poor beggar woman for a cruel bet, thinking it was just a game, thinking he could prove to his friends that money and pride ruled over love. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts, and what he discovered on their wedding night would not only change the way he saw her, but it would shatter his arrogance and teach him the deepest lesson of his life. It started in the glittering skyline of a big city where glass towers touched the clouds and expensive cars zipped through the streets. In that city lived Adrian Cross, a man in his early 30s, a self-made millionaire, owner of tech companies, real estate, and luxury chains. He was known not just for his wealth, but for his arrogance. He believed everything had a price tag: friendship, loyalty, even love. At one of his lavish parties, surrounded by wealthy friends who drank champagne from crystal glasses and laughed over shallow jokes, a conversation turned into a dangerous dare. One of them smirked and said, "Adrian, with all your money, you could probably marry anyone. But do you have the guts to marry someone with nothing? A beggar from a street?" The room erupted in laughter, and Adrian, with his pride stung and his ego blazing, said without hesitation, "I could marry a beggar tomorrow and still make her bow to me. Watch me." They laughed harder, not knowing those words were the first crack in Adrian's world of arrogance. The very next day, dressed not in his $1,000 suits, but in casual clothes to blend in, Adrian drove his sleek black car into the older part of the city, where cracked sidewalks and fading buildings replaced glass towers. There, on a street corner, he saw her, a young black woman, thin, dressed in torn clothes, her hair messy, her eyes carrying both exhaustion and fire. She held a cup out to strangers, some passing her with disgust, others with pity, but she stood there with a strange pride, not lowering her gaze. Her name was Amara, though Adrian didn't know it yet. To him, in that moment, she was nothing more than a pawn in his game. He approached her with a mocking smile and said words that made her heart stop. "How would you like to be my wife?" She looked at him, certain he was joking, but when he pulled out a diamond ring and flashed a smile of arrogance, she felt both fear and anger. Yet beneath that, a survival instinct kicked in. This man was rich, powerful. For her, someone who had been sleeping under bridges and scraping for food, his offer was dangerous, but also an escape. What she didn't know was that Adrian wasn't saving her. He was playing with her life. But what he didn't know was that Amara carried a truth far greater than his wealth. And soon, the hunter would become the hunted in the game he thought he controlled. Adrian didn't waste time. Within days, papers were signed, arrangements were made, and what started as a drunken dare at a party turned into an actual wedding ceremony that stunned everyone in his world. The tabloids screamed headlines: "Millionaire marries street beggar," as paparazzi snapped pictures of Amara in a borrowed white dress that barely fit, her eyes darting nervously under the flashing lights. Adrian stood tall beside her, smirking at his friends in the front row who winked and raised their glasses as if this was the best entertainment money could buy. To the wealthy elite that filled the hall, the wedding was a circus act, a joke, a performance of Adrian's power. But to Amara, every moment felt like walking into a cage where the walls were closing in. She didn't understand why this man chose her. She didn't know about the bet. All she knew was that a stranger had pulled her from the streets and put her in a world she had only seen from a distance. Inside, she carried suspicion, fear, and a glimmer of curiosity. She wasn't weak, though. For years, life had beaten her, tested her, and shaped her in a steel wrapped in skin. She had survived hunger, loneliness, and nights under cold rain. And she had learned that no matter how cruel the world could be, there was still a fire inside her that refused to go out. At the wedding reception, Adrian's friends toasted him with laughter. To Adrian, the only man bold enough to marry trash just to prove he could. The cruel words stabbed Amara like knives, but she kept her head high. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was dignity. She didn't know it, but her composure was already planting seeds of doubt in Adrian's heart. The more she carried herself with quiet strength, the more Adrian found himself unsettled. This was supposed to be easy: humiliate her, control her, and later boast about it. Yet when he looked at her across the table, with her deep brown eyes staring not with desperation, but with something unreadable, something almost regal, he felt a strange unease. That night, when they reached his penthouse, he expected submission. He expected gratitude. He expected her to kneel before his wealth, to marvel at the marble floors, the chandeliers, the endless view of the city skyline from walls of glass. Instead, Amara simply walked to the window, gazed at the lights, and whispered, "So many lights, yet so much darkness." Her words, simple yet heavy, unsettled Adrian in ways money never had. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. His arrogance told him to laugh it off, to remind her of her place, but something deeper whispered that maybe she wasn't the pawn he thought she was. That feeling grew when he noticed how she touched nothing in the room, as though none of it impressed her. She sat quietly, her back straight, her expression calm, and it made Adrian feel like the one under judgment. He went to bed that night thinking this game would be fun, thinking he would break her will. But what he didn't realize was that on their wedding night, he was the one who would break, and the truth she carried would shake his world to its core. As the wedding night approached, the millionaire felt a sense of triumph that was mixed with an unusual anxiety he could not quite define. The bet had been won. The audience of so-called friends who dared him into this farce would whisper in admiration about his ability to follow through with a joke that none of them ever imagined he'd complete. The black beggar he had chosen, standing before him now as his lawful wife, carried a grace that seemed to both confuse and intrigue him. For beneath her ragged origins was a silence that never cracked, a confidence that seemed almost misplaced given the imbalance of their worlds. The night after the wedding was expected to be one of satisfaction for him, the ultimate punchline to a cruel game. But as he entered the suite decorated with petals, champagne, and luxury, he noticed her demeanor did not reflect the fear or awkward gratitude he thought he'd find. Instead, she was calm, her eyes meeting his with something he could only describe as piercing honesty, and it made him feel as if he was suddenly being measured. The laughter he anticipated, the feeling of control, the mockery he planned to unleash by boasting about his conquest, all began to wither under that gaze. She broke the silence with a single statement that unsettled him. "I know why you chose me." He froze, realizing she was not just a beggar plucked randomly off the street, but someone who had allowed herself to be chosen, someone who knew more than he assumed. His heart pounded as she walked toward the window, pulling back the curtains to reveal the city lights shimmering across the skyline. Her silhouette strong, her voice steady as she told him there were truths about herself that no amount of money, pride, or arrogance could ever overshadow. He had expected weakness, dependence, and submission, yet what he found was a woman with dignity that not even her circumstances had stolen. As she revealed her story, her lineage, her past, and the sacrifices that forced her into the life of begging, the walls of his ego began to crack. This was not just a stranger he married on a foolish dare. This was a person with depth, resilience, and a hidden strength that mocked his ignorance far more than his arrogance mocked her poverty. The room seemed to shrink as her words spilled into the silence, not in anger, not in accusation, but with a clarity that felt like a mirror forcing him to look at himself. She told him about the life he never imagined a so-called beggar could have lived. A childhood of brilliance, scholarships that once opened doors to prestigious universities, a father who had been a respected professor, a mother who poured her soul into community service, and a family destroyed not by laziness or incompetence, but by political corruption and tragedy. She spoke of how her father had refused to bow to powerful men, how her mother had been cast aside after standing against exploitation, and how she, left with nothing, chose to survive with dignity rather than surrender her principles. Each sentence tore away the image he had crafted of her, dismantling the caricature of a nobody that he thought he had married. And as she spoke, he began to remember the looks of his so-called friends, those who had goaded him into this bed. And he realized they too had been hollow, shallow spectators in his life, no different than jackals circling a feast they didn't earn. She turned to him then, her face illuminated by the dim golden glow of the chandelier, and asked him a question he could not answer. "Tell me, what do you see in me now? A joke or a mirror of everything you lack?" His throat tightened, because for the first time in years, perhaps the first time ever, he had no clever remark, no smug reply, no laughter to hide behind. He realized that while he had thought he was in control, she had stripped him bare without raising her voice, without anger, simply by standing in the truth of who she was. The shock was not just that she was not what she seemed, but that in her he saw something terrifying, strength born from pain, resilience carved out of loss, and a kind of beauty that no wealth could purchase. His stomach churned with shame, a shame that reached back into his past, to every careless insult, every moment of arrogance, every laugh at the expense of someone weaker. Suddenly, he could not look her in the eyes, because those eyes no longer belonged to a beggar, but to a queen. And as she continued, revealing that she knew about the bet long before he thought she did, he felt his knees weaken. She admitted she accepted his proposal not out of desperation, but because she wanted to see how far he would go in humiliating another human being for entertainment, and more importantly, how long it would take for him to face the hollowness of his own soul. The revelation hit him harder than any slap could. He wasn't the hunter, he had been the prey in her quiet game of dignity all along. The woman he married, mocked, and thought to expose was the very one exposing him now, peeling back the layers of arrogance until all that remained was a man stripped of the illusion of superiority. He had thought his wealth made him powerful, but in that moment, in that room, on that wedding night, he realized he was the weakest man he had ever known, standing before the strongest woman he had ever met. He sat there frozen, staring at her as though she were both a stranger and the only person in the world who had ever truly seen him. For years he had built walls of marble, glass, and gold around himself, convincing the world and himself that he was untouchable. But tonight, in the quiet intimacy of a wedding chamber meant to symbolize triumph and love, he felt utterly stripped of his crown, left raw and exposed. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the faint echo of music still drifting from the banquet hall below. Her eyes never wavered, steady as a flame that refused to be extinguished, and with every heartbeat he felt a weight pressing against his chest, guilt, shame, and something new he couldn't yet name. For the first time in his life, the millionaire who always had the last word realized there was nothing he could say to justify himself. He whispered, almost himself, "I thought I was testing you, but you were testing me all along." His voice cracked, the arrogance gone, replaced with a humility he didn't know he had. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, drawing back the curtain to let the moonlight wash over her. Her posture was regal, and he noticed it with a kind of awe that surprised him. A beggar, he thought, that was the word he had used, but standing there, framed by silver light, she looked like royalty. She finally spoke, her tone steady but not unkind. "I wanted to see who you were without the money, without the title, without the audience cheering you on. And what I see is a man who has everything, yet nothing. A man who thinks he owns the world, but doesn't even own himself." Her words pierced deeper than any blade could, and he knew she was right. The bet that once felt like a game now burned in his memory like a brand of dishonor. Every laugh he had shared with his friends about her, every smug look came rushing back like poison flooding his veins. He lowered his head into his hands, and for the first time since he was a child, he wept. Quiet, broken sobs shook his frame, and he didn't care how pathetic he looked. For years he had believed showing emotion was weakness, but here, with her, he discovered that hiding from truth was the real weakness. She didn't mock him, didn't relish his tears the way he might have once relished hers. Instead, she stood quietly, her presence both fierce and tender, like a guardian of truth who had waited for this moment. When she finally walked back to him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder, he flinched at the touch. Not because it hurt, but because it carried forgiveness he didn't feel he deserved. "Change," she whispered. "Not for me, not for them. Change because you've finally seen yourself." Those words became his undoing and his salvation. In that moment, he knew this night would mark the end of the man he had been and the beginning of someone entirely new. He stood, wiping his tears, and looked at her not as a pawn in a cruel bet, but as the one who had saved him from himself. "You've won," he said softly, "but more than that, you've freed me." The truth of it settled deep inside him, shaking the foundations of the shallow life he had built. He realized he could never return to his friends, to the games, to the empty laughter of men who mistook cruelty for power. He would cut ties, face their mockery, and rebuild his life with meaning. And as he stood there beside her, still in the silence of their wedding night, he knew the bet that began in arrogance had ended in transformation. What shocked her was not his confession, nor his tears, but the vow he made that night, a vow to honor her not as a beggar, not as a wife for show, but as the woman who had taught a millionaire the true meaning of wealth.